everybody, to our session on understanding US politics. Quite a tall order that we want to fulfill today, but maybe we will be able to at least, well, make some of the fog or the chaos not vanish entirely, but maybe lift a bit in your heads. To start us off, big welcome to Tobias von Mehring. He is representative of all the students working in the background for the International Students Committee, and he has a few questions that he wants to see answered in this session. Welcome, Tobias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tobias von Mehring. I study business administration in my 6th semester, and I am a member of this year's International Students Committee. You will have seen my work as a communications team member if you looked at our social media in the last year, if you checked the program on the screens, looked at any sign on the campus, or looked at the images next to the program with the title, A Moment in Our History. Speaking of a moment in our history, 2024 is an election year, as I hope you're all well and aware of. Certainly an historic moment. If your candidate wins, you'll likely think the world is saved. And if they lose, well, you'll see darkness ahead. The thing is, though, your candidate has lost before, and the world didn't end. Your candidate probably has won before, yet the world is still as it is. Why is that? Well, at least in part, because of the United States House of Representatives and the Senate. They tend to act as a reality check to grand political ambitions. Far from being a solid, unified foundation, majority in the Senate is constantly being sought through intense campaigns for local elections. Victory here can mean just as much, if not more, than the presidency. Because if a president can rally the Senate and the House behind them, for better or worse, ambitious policies are no longer a problem. As a member of the young generation, I hope to understand the dynamics of US politics better, because they matter for Europe's future, my future, our future. This is why I'm so excited for Claudia Brühwiler as the moderator, and our two fantastic speakers, Jason Thielman and Rahul Sahgal, to spread some of the knowledge to us so that we can all learn more about this fascinating political system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. Today is a bit of a premiere because both our speakers are for the first time among the panelists of the St. Gallen Symposium, but for one of them, it's really a homecoming. Rahul Sahgal is a triple alum of our university. He has a licentiate in economics, in law, and he even did a PhD here. So welcome back home to your alma mater, Rahul. You will learn about his extremely fascinating career if you look up his resume or catch him on LinkedIn, where he hopefully will welcome your invitation. He has the kind of career that you would hope more people to have, because you have worked in the private sector. You then joined public service as a diplomat and worked at the end of your career in diplomacy in Bern, where you worked on taxation. You heard this morning Karin Keller-Sutter being very fond of a strong state, and that's what you took care of. And now he's again bridging the worlds between public service and business as the man who inherits the position of the legendary Martin Naville, who's here with us today, as the CEO of the Swiss-American Chamber of Commerce. You can learn all that and even more when you dive into his online CVs, but what you don't learn is his history here at the symposium. So you are, for the first time, a speaker, but you have helped the symposium as a student. You were hosting Leaders of Tomorrow in your humble student abode, and you were even a driver. So this is a homecoming of all sorts. It's less of a homecoming for Jason Thielman, but I learned yesterday that the scenery here reminds you of your home state. You come from the land of shining mountains, the state of Montana. Santis doesn't shine in this weather, but I hope you caught a glimpse of its best state yesterday. And in a sense, you fit very well here because you studied finance as your first degree, so you could have very well ended up in one of these seats as an exchange student.
I don't know if you would have accepted me.
I think so.
I wasn't the best student, hence I went into politics. But.
Well, but you went into politics via business, which is a very high-ski thing to do, as Rahul demonstrates. You went into marketing in the finance sector, and then you took these skills, finance and marketing, and went to the logical place, as you said, politics. And if you hear Jason talk about politics, you really hear his marketing background, because I heard you describe your first gubernatorial race that you worked for as a one-day sale. I'm curious to hear what you describe the senatorial races as. But you then worked for Senator Steve Daines as his chief of staff, and since he was pitched as chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, he made you executive director, and he said at your appointment that this is, I quote, bad news for the Democrats. So we have invited the bad news to us in St. Gallen, and I hope you are having a good welcome so far. Let's see how the Q&A shifts the welcome, maybe. But we are all looking towards the United States, and November 5th is probably marked in a lot of agendas as the day when you will have watch parties, and everyone is glued to one number: 270 electoral votes to win the White House. But I think as the man in charge of the Republicans winning back the Senate majority, you might look at the electoral map a bit differently. So what will you be watching most closely on November 5th, Jason?
What is interesting about the presidential election in the Senate battleground states is that they dramatically overlap. So the key places in the presidential race, as you referenced, right, it's not a popular vote in the United States. It's determined by electoral votes, each state having a different set of electoral votes. The 5 battleground Senate states, where you have toss-up swing Senate states, are the same 5 battleground states that will determine the outcome of the presidential election. Now, we do have 3 states that are not part of the presidential battleground that are our most likely Senate flip states. These are very conservative red states, beginning with West Virginia, which is an open Senate seat with Joe Manchin retiring. But these are states, West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio, that are not presidential battlegrounds, but are states that have kind of one outlier left for the Democrat Party that we're specifically targeting. So I will be looking at a few things differently than the presidential campaigns, but most of the outcome will overlap for the Senate races as it does the presidential.
And you will be quite glued to the screens, I imagine, because you said the magic number this year for the Republican Party is 300.
Yes.
Can you enlighten us on that?
Right. As you're probably aware, everyone is up for the House of Representatives every 2 years in our federal elections, presidential election every 4 years, but the Senate has staggered terms, 6-year staggered terms. So a third of the Senate is up on any given 2-year election cycle. What makes this particular election cycle so significant for the U.S. Senate is where those seats are up. And it is the reason, when you're in my position, you have a cause for a great deal of optimism for change of control of the chamber. Because those seats are almost all seats that would be competitive that Democrats currently hold. So the Republican Party is almost entirely on offense, and the Democrats are playing almost exclusively defense. We have 9 Senate seats that we have a reasonable chance of being successful that Democrats are heavily defending. And what's especially unique, as I referenced a minute ago, and the importance of the 300 number, is we have 3 what we refer red state Democrats, that Montana, West Virginia, and Ohio, that are up. These are states where Republicans have supermajorities in the state legislature. All of the other state constitutional officers, like governor and attorney general, are Republican. The other senator is a Republican, and split delegations are increasingly rare in the United States. In 1980, 26 of the Senate delegations were split delegations. Today we only have 4 delegations that are split in America. So this correlation of outcomes for presidential and Senate races makes those 3 Senate seats especially vulnerable for the Democrats and difficult to hold. Now, conversely, when you go to look at what does the Senate map look like in 2026, where are those seats up, and you look at the Senate map in 2028, there are none of these red state Democrats up for election. So Republicans are not going to have a very good offensive opportunity of gaining seats in 26 or 28. So if we're going to flip control of the chamber for the U.S. Senate, it's going to happen in 2024, given we have 0 of these low-hanging fruit opportunities in 26 and 28. It's somewhat worth noting the Democrats don't have, it's become somewhat of a static map. The Democrats only have one blue state Republican who would be up in those subsequent election cycles as well, and that's Susan Collins from the state of Maine. So if Republicans get 51 seats, right, which would be a majority from the current 49, the Democrats might have a chance, if they retain control of the presidency, of flipping the chamber back reasonably with Susan Collins up in 2026. But if we get to 52 or 53, they have pretty limited opportunities to flip control of the chamber. So control of the U.S. Senate has the potential of being determined for the remainder of the decade in the 2024 election cycle.
So you're delivering the bad news this year or never in this decade?
That's right.
So Rahul, what will you be looking for on November 5th? What will interest you the most? It's probably not necessarily the senatorial race in Montana, even though it's important to Jason and those working for the senatorial majority of Republicans. But as CEO of the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce, what interests you in this cycle?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you also for having me and for the kind introduction. The Senate race is part of it. I think probably there are 2 areas we are looking into. Number one are the swing states. That's always a question of definition, but the states that in 2016 and 20 made a significant difference. Those are states like Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and maybe, I don't know, North Carolina or Nevada. So just seeing, because at the end in the last 2 races, the difference between the President Biden and President Trump were quite small. We're talking about 300,000 votes or something, and probably that's going to be a very decisive factor for the race in the White House. And then the second thing is that at the moment, probably the working assumption is that we do not think that there's going to be a triple victory, meaning thereby that not one party is going to win the White House, the House of Representatives and the Senate. But that's going to make a big difference, because I think, and that's what you said also, that if you have a divided a majority in the chambers, you have a more balanced, or you have more continuity than if you have one party that dominates all through the system. So I think that's the second big thing we are looking into. I think I agree with your assessment as far as the Senate is concerned. The House of Representatives could also be close, as well as the White House.
In the midterm elections in 2022, your party had a bit of an issue with senatorial candidates. Mitch McConnell said that there was problems with candidate quality, as he described it. If we look back, we had quite colorful candidates like Mehmet Oz or Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, Herschel Walker in Georgia. To what extent do you think will you have candidate quality under control this year?
We've made a focus of candidate recruitment prior to the NRSC and for the Senate Republicans. Looking back, as you mentioned, in 2022, there was relative consensus across the political ecosystem that had we ran different candidates or had stronger campaigns, which I think is maybe a more fair assessment than just the candidate themselves, we would have had different outcomes. And when you look at the outcome in those states, Arizona was one place where we had a controversial Republican Senate candidate who narrowly lost the election. If that Senate candidate had received the same number of votes as the Republican candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives in the state of Arizona, so same electorate across six members of Congress in the state of Arizona, our Senate candidate would have won by 6,000 votes. In the state of Georgia, had Herschel Walker received the same number of votes as all the candidates, as the Republican candidates running for the U.S. House of Representatives, he would have won by more than 40,000 votes. And had we seen the same situation in the state of Nevada, and Adam Laxalt, who is our Republican candidate there, he would have won by 22,000 votes. So it's natural to conclude from that the votes were there for Republicans. What happened is the candidates did not manage to achieve the average Republican vote threshold that exists in the state. Those issues have more complexity and nuances beyond that, but there's no doubt that was a significant issue. Difficult Republican primaries were difficult, also significantly contributed to making these candidates weaker and their campaigns weaker compared to their the Democratic counterparts. So one thing that is very different that most pundits are recognizing about the setup in the 2024 cycle and the prospects to be sanguine about Republicans' opportunities to regain the Senate is that we have avoided significant Republican primaries in many of these, if not almost all of these key states, which contributes a great deal to undercutting and making it difficult to win. And we have candidates that are recognized as being much stronger, who can win, as we like to say, both a primary election, where you have to appeal more to the base of the electorate, but can do so in a way that they also appeal to the general election electorate.
You have mentioned a lot of factors that contributed to your losses in 2022, but you have circumvented one factor that everyone said cost the Republicans the last 3 national elections, and that was your former president, or at some point your president, who will be the candidate again, or so it seems, Donald Trump. So what factor will he play in the senatorial races? To what extent are the dynamics of the presidential campaign intertwined with the senatorial ones?
Well, they're very intertwined, and many folks look at the past 2 cycles and draw the conclusion that you did. I think really there was, the failure was a failure for Senate campaign operation and the presidential campaign operation, which was still obviously in waiting in 2022. To work more closely together in determining who were our best prospects for winning the United States Senate. And as part of our process of trying to avoid these primaries and make sure we had the strongest possible candidate, we've worked very closely with President Trump and his campaign team, and I would say we're going to be successful in retaking the Senate in 2024, not in spite of, but because of President Trump's active involvement, where he, along with Chairman Daines of the Senatorial Committee, have been hand in glove in picking whom we think would be the strongest possible candidates and putting all of our combined resources behind their success.
So you will win because of
Yes.
Donald Trump and not in spite. I will
Correct.
come back to that. Rahul, the Swiss-US relationship is, at least from a Swiss perspective, a very special one. We like to call each other sister republics. And we have this wisdom floating around that we are particularly sisterly when the White House is in Republican hands. So do you agree with that assessment? Do we have to speculate for a Republican majority for Switzerland to have the best outcomes in the future, or how do you see things?
That's an interesting question. So I agree with the sister republic thing, and that is also due to the constitution of our 2 countries and also the setup, the federalistic system. You have the 2 chambers and so on. So I do think there's a lot, and if one wanted to go back in history, there are also clear reasons why there are similarities in the. It's not a coincidence that our 2 countries have a similar setup and constitution and federalistic structure. As far as what you said with the Republican or the Democratic Party, I think I disagree, because if you look at least the last 30 years, our relationship with the US has been good. There have been hiccups, as with every sister, I guess.
As in every family.
As in every family, exactly. But if you look at the last 30 years, the relationship and the trade has gone up. If you look at the figures, I think we have had 18 years of a democratic government in the US and 12 Republican in the last 30 years, and you do not see any significant deviation in any of the figures if you look at Democratic or Republican presidencies. So I don't think that makes such a significant difference. Please.
But we had our hopes up higher when Donald Trump was in the White House with regards to an FTA, a free trade agreement. And we seem to have the kind of ambassador here who was also working towards that. Do you think there are chances that we could work towards a free trade agreement again, irrespective of who is in the White House?
So I think firstly, if you maybe also go a step back, in 2006, we entered into free trade negotiations with the US, and Switzerland walked away from the table because of our agricultural policies and subsidies, and we did not want. So, and apparently, we are the only country that walked away from the US during free trade negotiations. We tried again, and at that time I was at the embassy in Washington, D.C. in 2019. But the interest was not, or the positive impact of a free trade agreement was not significant enough at that time, because as I said before, I mean, our relationship we have had a growth of the last 20 years in export of about 10% year on year. So it's tripled in the last 20 years. So probably you can say that it's going well, in spite of not having a free trade agreement. On the other hand, a free trade agreement, what it does, it gives you a structure, it gives you a structured, also a path to have a dialogue with the other country. In our case, we always try to also see what the European Union is doing. So if we can move before the European Union, we are happy, because that gives us a certain, it's kind of a certain insurance, to put it in that way. However, I think with the way things are going currently, the appetite for a free trade agreement from the US side is probably rather limited. I think what is possible are what they call mini trade deals. So we concluded an MRA in the pharmaceutical area last year. The US has over 1,000 mini trade deals with over 120 countries, and that to a certain extent makes sense. It also makes sense because it doesn't have to pass the Congress. So it's kind of an executive agreement that can be taken care of much quicker. In Switzerland, it's a bit different depending upon what the structure is. I think Democrats have probably close to zero appetite in negotiating with us on a full-fledged free trade agreement. Republicans, a little bit more than that, but also it's not a priority, I would say, currently.
Can we work on your appetite, Jason? We have the head of Swiss MEM here, for instance. The Swiss AmCham is anyway representing a lot of different industries. It seems that the Republican Party has kind of lost its economic policy heart, where you used to have a clear vision of trade is beneficial to the nation and thus also to us. So where do you see the Republicans headed in terms of economic policy, and could we whet your appetite for an FTA?
Well, I think if we go back to the waning months of the Trump administration, Ambassador McMullen, I think, had President Trump to a point where he was very close or ready to commit to advancing an FTA. So I think there would be cause for optimism should Trump come back to office and you have Republicans back in control of the Senate who, regardless of the observation of perhaps not having the same enthusiasm for trade as we have previously, are still much more so than our counterparts on the Democrat side. But I do think also it's really important to recognize the important role this university has played in helping craft that FTA, which was to a point of having the enthusiasm and the support of the prior administration. And I understand that this university was very critical in the development and working through as really the leading economic free market institution here in Switzerland, and in many ways.
Don't say that too loud. Not everyone likes to hear that.
Well, I would. No. But you do raise another interesting point here with regards to some of the changes, right, in the coalitions that make up the respective political parties. And one of the reasons that Trump is poised to win the presidential election, if the election were held today, it's not, so you can't really hold me to this prediction, so it'll be meaningless potentially by November, right? But Trump would probably receive 312 of the 270 necessary electoral votes. That's even more than the 306 electoral votes that he received in his 2016 victory. Much of the reason for that is what Democrats have always referred to as their blue wall, the Rust Belt industrial manufacturing states of Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are states that are much more poised today, like they were, but even more so in the case of Michigan, to vote for Republicans. And the reason for that is the Democrat Party, which was really going back to FDR and beyond, had an agrarian working class base that was pitted against the merchant class, has really fundamentally changed as they've adopted cultural issues as their sort of trinity of faith over economic issues. And the Republican Party, as a result, is winning larger and larger shares of the working class vote, right? When Bill Clinton was elected president, he won by, I think, 30 points it was, those in the lowest fifth of of our society economically, right? Donald Trump lost that group by 3 points in 2016, and he will win that demographic in 2024. Now, what's also more notable about that is what began as a kind of white working class coalition is now expanding to become a multiracial, multi-ethnic working class coalition. And the adherence of this working coalition for Democrats that started with, across the spectrum, they lost the white working class vote, but now they're losing the Hispanic working class vote. In states like Nevada, where Trump is leading dramatically, he has a strong lead in large part because he's now winning the Hispanic vote. Same thing like in Arizona, which he lost in 2020. And in Michigan, he's poised to receive 29% of the African American vote, according to polls today. He won 11% of that vote in 2020.
So you are really delineating and giving us a very good outlook on how the political landscape has changed. And you have described how the blue wall in the Midwest has already crumbled. Many argue that this has not just been a change in the political landscape, but also in the political culture and in society at large. Rahul, you were in DC at the Swiss embassy stationed during the time where some say America changed profoundly from 2017 onwards. And how do you perceive it? Are you looking at a different America than the one that you started your posting in?
So I think one thing that is certainly different is that at the end, so I was there from 2017 till 2021, you had the 6th of January event that everyone can decide on their own whether it was an attempt to a coup d'etat or not. I mean, I have my personal opinion on that, but I think that changed a lot in what people think is possible in the US or not. As far as the political culture is concerned, I do think that social media, and it was also discussed this morning on a panel, has had its effect in polarizing people. I think that if you look at statistics, that the legislation that is made across the aisle has diminished, it's gone down. At the moment, it's kind of like often they say that if you want to get something done, then you've got to bring something that has a relation with China, because you know that China is the only point that both parties agree on. So I think there is an increasing polarization. Now, has it come to a point that it exceeds what has been going on in the previous decades in the US? I'm not so sure, because if you look at the 60s, 70s, Vietnam War, we talked about Iran, we talked about also, so there have been quite tough periods for the U.S. democracy in many ways, also violent and brutal. That's why I think it's also interesting to watch what's going to happen now with these whole Gaza protests. Is it something that's kind of isolated? Because they are getting violent is a big word, but you still have security forces, you have people getting taken out, arrested, and so on. So I think also it's going to we are the early days, but what is going to be the impact, or how could also this have an impact in the next 6 months on the presidential election? So I think the culture has become more divisive and aggressive over the years.
Are we reliving the 60s? Because that would mean good news for the Republicans if we're looking back at 1968 when the Democratic National Convention was brought into chaos thanks to students protesting, etc. Do you expect similar scenarios? Will the controversies surrounding these university encampments, the protests by students against their university's investment policies, will that have any effect on the national election?
You're not suggesting I have eyewitness experience of the 60s, are you?
No, that's not one. But
but
every political strategist is a good student of history, and I don't doubt for a minute that you're that too.
I don't think you can draw a straight line from the degree of civil discord that existed into the 60s to the level of angst that you see on college campuses today over the issue of Gaza. This is, very much limited to college campuses. It's not expanding remotely beyond college campuses. It does have political saliency, right? My committee released on the day I was flying out here ads attacking all of the sitting Democrat senators in these competitive seats and tying them to those protests of those university students and the disruption they're causing on campus, and what in many ways we see as a frightening degree of emerging anti-Semitism on these campuses, and that's become an important political issue, and it also is an illustration of the larger cultural divide that exists between the two parties, whereas before it was more of a class divide. It's increasingly becoming more of a cultural divide between the parties.
You used an interesting phrasing there. You said you released ads tying Democratic candidates to these campus protests. Are they tied to them, or are you tying them to them?
No, I think they are tied to them. They're failing to call out many of these activities. They're failing to defend the state of Israel and its right to defend itself. They're failing to call out the anti-Semitism that's existing in these campuses. In many cases, they're also more directly benefiting from the same organization groups and donors that are behind funding, backing, and promoting these protests.
But this is a very combative way of doing politics, the way that these campaigns are run in the United States. It's quite alienating to us in Switzerland, where elections are not really that exciting of an affair. And
I chose the right place to practice my profession.
And when we're listening to you also have a bit of a militaristic way of phrasing things, battleground states, you're in the trenches, etc. But at the same time, people tie, or used to tie, the hope of betterment to politics. So how can a Senate become a cooling saucer again, as George Washington envisioned it, for calm and collective debates, when already the race there is so combative and antagonistic?
I think there's a tendency to romanticize history and to hearken back to the times where people were more friendly and we shared cups of hot chocolate and that sort of thing. And I don't think that, politics in America has always been an aggressive blood sport between the parties, right? Because we have people. America was founded on a revolution, right? We were founded over people who were passionate about ideas and the way the country and what kind of country they wanted, and those passions and intensity around the vision for America remains. Although I don't think one should extrapolate from that the cooling saucer of our process allows those tensions to be let out very regularly through a very civil process. Like anywhere, occasionally, those things boil over some, but the Senate continues to play the role envisioned by our founders of being very much a cooling saucer, right? To effectively advance legislation on most issues, it requires 60 votes in the US Senate. So even should Republicans win 51, 52, 53, or 54, there isn't a realistic path for either party anytime in the near future to get to the sort of 60 votes, which will always require some form of bipartisan compromise.
You described American politics to blood sports. I think if we were describing Swiss politics, we would rather say it's an apéro, it's a reception. The former ETH president said Switzerland is governed by apéro. So how do we engage with a country that is run so differently, Rahul? Does that make your job a lot more difficult, or is it just a question of adapting tactics? Are you taking Aikido lessons, for instance?
I think it is a question of adapting tactics. I think as every government or as every organization, but also as a government, we need to, especially when you have a new election, we need to meet the new people, try to make ties. I think if I look back at my time, it was certainly easier to get into the Trump administration at the beginning than it was with the Biden administration, and that is not because we were in a I don't think it was because we were in a privileged position or anything, just because the people were they were very different in the Trump administration. There were more people that came from, they had a business background, they were intrigued by Switzerland, they were intrigued by, we are not in the EU. But I mean, the job is exactly the same. We need to speak, and hence also what I said before. So we do not, and we do not have the right, and we also do not want to have any preference between the political parties or the people, because that's not our business. It's a free country, and we work with the government that country has.
So you roll with the punches, so to speak, to stay in the more combative.
I think, I mean, as Switzerland, we have other ways to bring our interests to the table than punches.
You said, sorry.
But if I may, just to follow on that, right? We refer to people who are working on campaigns, as war chiefs, right? They're the folks, to use more of these sort of descriptions that, but when it comes to governing, the type of people that you want to bring in as your senior staff and senior aides, they're not your wartime chiefs, they're your peacetime chiefs, right? There's a distinction between the methods and the tactics that are involved in winning campaigns from the methods and the tactics that are involved in governing. One of the pieces of advice and counsel that are given to people running governor's races, for example, in the United States that most follow, is you don't hire the person who ran your campaign to be your chief of staff, your primary chief operating officer. You hire someone else because they're stuck in sort of wartime combative mode. Then you need to move to governing and building consensus. When I was a chief of staff on the Hill, not a campaign chief like I am now, I had regular meetings with Democrat chiefs where we would come together for dinner and discuss issues. I had no difficulty, neither did my boss. He and Elizabeth Warren, right, who's considered one of the more progressive icons, they talk on the phone all the time about legislation and ideas. There's an ability, I think, I wouldn't want to leave folks with the sense here that bipartisanship, the ability for people to overcome these differences and these fierce, hard-fought campaigns over ideas and principles that people are passionate about, then it moves to governing. And our system forces you to do that, which I think is the beauty and the resiliency of the American system.
But just to build on that quite quickly before we go into Q&A, you mentioned that the peacetime chiefs are different than the wartime chiefs. And many said that working with the Trump administration went well because the peacetime chiefs were experienced administrators. They were people who had a policy background that wasn't so different from previous administrations. But now many people are concerned, many observers, critics, journalists, etc., that this time around, should Donald Trump take the White House, the peacetime chiefs might not so might not be so peaceful at all. And everyone's pointing to the Project 2025 by the Heritage Foundation that lays out a complete Republican takeover of national administration. How well-founded are these fears from your perspective?
I think it's important to have, important to look beyond the sort of the CNN and Der Spiegel, did I say that correctly, sort of productions here of how to perceive these things. Every incoming administration, President Republican or Democrat, usually has folks either officially or unofficially working on the policy side of how are you going to advance the agenda and accomplish what it is that you set out in your campaign and to move America closer to the vision that you have in place. I also think it's worth noting that Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita are the two co-campaign chiefs for the Trump campaign, have specifically said that anyone putting out plans of what the next administration, who's going to be staffing the next administration, are doing so completely unlicensed and unauthorized by President Trump or the Trump campaign. So really what out there is not different, just given a lot more heavily dramatized by those that wish to create fear and try to move voters who think there might be some dramatic draconian change to our process and our government, as opposed to the more kind of reasoned, rational, historical perspective of how these things often work and what goes on in the periphery.
You used the word dramatize, or you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just maybe on what you were saying, because I think one of the assumptions we work with is that we say that, okay, during the last Trump administration, if he was to become president again, number one, many of the things he promised, or whatever one wants to call that, during his campaigning, he actually didn't do, but it was more to get the voters to vote for him and then kind of move around that, but he actually didn't really do it. Some people, even of the administration, at that time told us that, the tweets he sends are for the public, because we got worried. There were a couple of topics, and he said, that's not for you, so you talk to me, we'll tell you what you need to do. So that's number one. And number two is that I think during the last administration, there were quite a few what they call adults in the room that could, and again, I do not know honestly whether that's correct or not, that could keep Trump from doing the worst he maybe could have done. And now the question is, if that's a correct hypothesis, would the next Trump administration be the same thing, or number one, okay, that with what he promises during the election, during the campaigning is one thing, but the second thing is, I think the base, and maybe Jason disagrees, but I guess the Republican base has become more radical than it was in 2016. Meaning thereby that I think maybe President Trump today thinks that he needs to staff his, and we're talking about 4,000 political appointees across the board, differently than he thought he has to do that in 2016, and maybe be more radical than he was back then. And there was just this week in The Economist an article on that, and their opinion actually didn't cover what I think. Their opinion was more that a Trump 2.0 is going to be far more disruptive and radical and with tariffs and all than a Trump 1.0. So I'm not completely sure, because he has certain people, they left him and they are unhappy and they write against him, like a Bolton and all, or either they left or Trump made them leave. But then you have people like Mike Pompeo, the National Security Advisor, Bob O'Brien and all. Those people are there and they could theoretically come back in if so. And with those people, we could work at that time at least.
Would you like to assure us quickly, Jason, that we won't be in radical waters?
I think you're in radical waters now when you look at the appointees, the judges, the cabinet levels coming from the Biden administration. So I really just kind of reject the premise of this, of the question and the concern. I think the concern many people have in America and why Trump is poised to win is because the Biden administration, has put forward so many radical folks that are outside of the mainstream of our country and where people would like to see the country like to see the country govern. Obviously, I have far more confidence in the type of people that Trump and the Trump administration would move forward than the Biden administration.
Do you have names, or because you said you have more trust in them in those he would nominate? Do you have any names already?
I don't have any names that I would.
That would have been quite the scoop for us.
Privileged to be able to break to you here in this particular venue. But I think you should. Go back to this, right? You should look back at what happened more in the prior administration. You have a proof point. This isn't someone coming from Mars who's going to be who's going to be a new president. You have a sense of it. And I think if you look at a comparative analysis, you tell me, was the world safer and more secure when Trump was president, or is it safer and more secure when Biden was president? You can argue causation or correlation if you would like, but I think it's difficult to make the case to say that the world is more secure, peaceful, and stable under President Biden as leader of the free world than it was as President Trump under the free world.
You brought in a rhetorical question. We want to have now real questions from you guys. There should be a mic floating around, and I'd suggest that thank you, Tobias, that we first take 2 or 3 questions together. Claudia, Tobias, please go here. And please stand up to ask your question. Quickly tell us who you are and then shoot.
Happy to stand up. Claudia Süßmann-Dijkhoff. This is my alma mater, and I'm part of the Board of Trustees of the St. Gallen Symposium. Jason, this is a question to you, and I'm not going into the Biden-Trump overall dynamic, and just observing, you seem to be quite proud of your system, right? And as an outsider, I'm really struggling with the situation with both candidates. And so I'm wondering, what would need to change in your system to at least allow for strong alternatives to those candidates? Why aren't there on both sides? Try to be balanced. Why aren't there better alternatives?
You should question the founding fathers. That's going to be tricky for a Republican, but please.
I think, again, what is so interesting about these observations, which are common, is these observations are not unique. When it was Bush running and Clinton running, when it was Bush and Gore running, when it was the same sort of commentary was quite frequent amongst many. Why can't we do better than one of these 2 men or these men and women running for president? I think that is far more reflective of the nature of and combativeness, right, of the political process, where you have far more interest in a horse race than you do in a horse show, or a dog fight than a dog show, if you prefer. And as a result, everyone is focusing, writing stories that are being pushed by one side or the other, or that the media finds an interesting narrative, which is constantly trying to give all the reasons you shouldn't like, shouldn't trust, or fear if the other side is successful in the outcome of these contests. So I think I would change the media before I would find the need to change the nominees.
We would suggest abandon winner-takes-all system, go to proportionate representation. We work fine with that in Switzerland. Other questions? Maybe not attack the founding fathers, that might lead too far, but...
Thank you. My name is Andrei Biruchenko. I'm working at the Embassy of Ukraine. You have talked a lot of interesting things, but predominantly it's about domestic agenda, how the kitchen is running, how the mechanisms are moving one candidate or another in a better position. But I like the point you made about the necessity and crucial things, talking to your let's say, not adversaries, but opponents from the different camp, and finding solutions in a bipartisan basis, wherever you are talking about. It was not so much told about the foreign policy and the implications of Iran, and of course, I'm not going to speculate that. The only thing I can say that we highly appreciate the consensus which has been found finally. Yeah, everybody wished it be done earlier or before or even overnight, but it's not the way the democratic system is functioning. However, I just would like to encourage you in saying that making history is not easy, but it's really worth doing. Please do.
Thank you so much for your intervention. I'll turn this into a question. Why are Republicans playing Russian roulette with Europe? You were too polite, so I'm doing the dirty work here.
Well, I don't think it's fair to suggest it's Republicans who are playing Russian roulette with Europe. I think it is far more fair to question why it is that Europe allowed themselves to make themselves completely dependent upon a country like Russia for their energy security. Why is it that Europe completely dismantled its military-industrial base and is completely incapable of defending and protecting itself, of making the necessary weapons to defend themselves? Why is it Europe failed to meet its minimum thresholds according to its treaty requirements for NATO so they would be in a stronger position and have more credibility with the US public, who has been defending Europe at great expense? So I think it's more Europe has played Russian roulette, and the United States has been the shield to make sure that bullet didn't hit you.
Wow. Well, Switzerland got a lot of criticism from the United States as well in the wake of the war against Ukraine because of the sanctions against Russia. You know a lot about tax evasion and evasive fiscal strategies, and Ambassador Scott Miller criticized us for not being more forceful in getting the sanctions really work. And at the same time, the Swiss government was saying, well, our system works a certain way. Do you think, Rahul, we're doing a good enough job at carrying these sanctions as well? And are we also making a good enough job of explaining to our US counterparts how our system works and how we keep up our rule of law?
So as far as the sanctions are concerned, I think we did a very good job. We followed the EU sanctions. They were published on Thursday, and by Monday we had implemented them, and we worked over the weekend, and we did what we were supposed to do. I think what we do not do very well, and I think we have also, we discussed it a lot. I'm not sure whether we actually really have learned any lessons. We do not communicate very well. So we, for example, you said Ambassador, you mentioned Ambassador Scott Miller, the US Ambassador to Switzerland. He says, so how many billions have you frozen? And so we came out with that figure of 7 point something. We were the only country at that time that had even published a figure. The US or other European countries had not even published a figure, and then later on the UK came with some figure that, and then do you count assets, you only count bank. So what we do not do very well as a Swiss government, I would say, is we fall back into that being pressurized and being put in the corner, and you are a bad student, you're not doing your work. Although many other countries are not even publishing what they are actually doing. So I think, with that, I don't want to say that others are worse than we are, but I don't think that we were doing anything that we were not supposed to. And now we are at the point, the US just agreed on this whole thing with the Russian sovereign wealth, that one could use it for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And there, maybe coming back to a discussion we had or a panel this morning, if you are a country that thinks it's important that you have a legal certainty, then you cannot just do it without. And again, I agree, one has to be flexible and rise up to the occasion, but one cannot just do something that one then will not do in another similar conflict. So one always has to keep the long term in mind because this is probably, unfortunately, not the last time that Europe or the US or whosoever is in this situation. There are probably many more such conflicts going to come up.
We don't hope
No, we
to
do
this
not,
extent, but yes, you're right, of course. Do we have any more questions? Oh, in the very back. Tobias, the other mic is already wandering there, but maybe someone else also has a question, so Tobias can already bring the mic to you. But please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Clara Stride. I'm a German and US American citizen, so extremely interested in what you had to say. First of all, I think the St. Gallen idea lives. I organized this symposium 30 years ago, and the idea of talking to each other, I think, is great. First of all, because you revised my image of politicians from Montana. After everybody has watched Yellowstone, you look a lot more decent than what
I haven't took anyone to the train station.
No, but on a more serious note, I found your intervention, I didn't love the content, but I thought it was very intelligent when you talked about Russian roulette. In that spirit, as an American and a German, when you look at the EU, which for us EU citizens is much of a pillar of what we believe stability and well-being of the future could be, at least. What are your views, Jason, on what we ought to be doing differently in the EU?
It's a great question, deserves a thoughtful answer. As we
think
say back home, I'll
Swiss
filibuster here as I
would
give
have a
myself
lot of
thought to come up
ideas.
with something wise and intelligent. I think actions that would reflect well upon both the long-term viability and the security and the concept of the EU, and place the member countries and your efforts in a better position to motivate and incentivize the United States to play the role in the world that you would like to see, would be for the EU to take a more practical approach to a number of policy issues that impact both the member countries as well as impacting the world, much as I referenced a moment ago, especially as it relates to energy security. And energy security, by the way, does not mean taking a country that has the lowest potential for solar power in the industrialized world, like Germany, and putting up a lot of solar panels used with products that are mined by countries in control, in a product that's in control of a country like China. That is not energy security, that is energy delusion. So I think approaching issues like that differently, approaching issues like being better positioned to protect and manage your own national security. I think working more closely and adopting an approach closer to the United States as it relates to the rising concern of the threat of China and the threat of countries like Iran would hearken us back to the traditional brotherhood and common cause that our two countries have often had through most of recent history, which has led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and advanced the interests of the free world and brought about some of the greatest economic security that the world has ever known.
Rahul, as someone who has both Brussels and DC experience, where do you think should the EU work on its relations with the US? What should the EU as a collective do differently vis-a-vis the US?
Yeah, I'm not really in favor of giving advice to other countries or governments what they should do. I mean, I think one thing is what Jason said.
Not publicly, anyway.
Exactly, or not publicly, exactly. Exactly, or not publicly, exactly, and there are no Chatham House rules here. So, but I think, one thing what Jason said before, this whole thing with the dependency is just it's just not good. It's not healthy, and I do not think that it doesn't help the US to help Europe. And it also doesn't make Europe, and I'm not even talking about the European Union, I'm talking about Europe also as a continent, a free free entity, because if you depend on security from the US and if you depend on trade, and I just don't think it's the right model. So I think personally Europe needs to step up and become again also economically powerful and self-sustaining. Whether we talk about energy, defense, same for Switzerland. That's why I'm talking about Europe overall.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid time has already run out, but since this is so much better than coffee, I still want to take a final question. Rahul, my own, sorry. But we will have coffee afterwards, and then you can join these guys. So Rahul, this has been your first public appearance, if we don't count the one online, for the Swiss American Chamber of Commerce, his first proper day of work, so to speak, and that at the alma mater. When we invite you back next year, where would you like Swiss-US relations to stand?
Even better than now. I hope that we will have by then signed a double taxation agreement, because I think that is something we are mutually, Swiss companies invest have invested over 300 billion in the US, and we have and all that is a sign, and we need that double taxation agreement. So I hope we will have signed that. Secondly, I think with whichever administration we are going to work with, that we have a good working relationship, and that I guess overall for the world that we still have a certain amount of stability and continuity in whatever is going to be then on the plate.
Jason, we know what you hope for on November 5th. But what do you hope for the United States where it shall stand in a year? Irrespective of who's in government? What are your wishes also for your 3 children? What should change in the near future?
What working families, including my family, most want to see going forward in the United States, and the reason that I think Republicans are going to be successful is in 2019, a cart full of groceries cost the average family $100. It costs $139 today. To fill up your vehicle cost $59 then, it costs $84 today. What I most want to see, and my family has been very blessed and fortunate, but the people who are most marginalized in our society, I want them to be in a position where they have economic security, that they have hope for the future, that they have pride in their country and love of country, and that we have a world that is peaceful and less dangerous than it is today. And I hope for a free Ukraine and to see Putin defeated.
Wonderful. That's a note that we take into the break. You're all invited back to coffee and also to join our panelists for further chats. Rahul, thank you for spending your first work days with us, with your alma mater. You probably studied very different things here. Jason, we were so happy and excited to have you with us and to hear how a political operator's mind works. We love you as a wartime captain, and we hope to see you back in peace times. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. There we go.